Thousands of years ago, Native Americans came to live in the Great Basin of the North American West. Scientific archaeological evidence can verify the presence of people in the basin for at least 13,000 years, one of the longest documented periods of human habitation in North America. Early residents of the Great Basin left behind them basketry fragments, arrowheads, and other possessions, which have been found in dry caves and rock shelters and around their campsites and chipping locations. With these artifacts, archaeologists have been able to piece together the patterns of a Great Basin desert culture. The material culture of the Basin people varied only in detail, according to local environmental differences. The inheritors of that ancient culture are the contemporary Washos, Shoshones, and the southern and northern Paiutes. One group of northern Paiutes lives on a small reservation near Burns, Oregon, in Harney Valley. Their ancestors were probably living in the valley long before Europeans had discovered the New World. This film is a response to the interest of the Burns Paiute Tribe in preserving a record of their heritage. Today, only the elder members of the Paiute families recall living in the traditional ways, and with each passing generation, the link with the past becomes more and more fragile. The Great Basin is a vast 4,000-foot plateau in the interior of the western United States. A tri-state region, including parts of Oregon, Nevada, and Idaho, is today identified as the Northern Great Basin. Traditionally, this has been the home of the Northern Paiutes. This interior plateau is made up of a series of basins from which there is little or no outward drainage. Each basin valley has its own geological arrangement of lowlands, often an old lake bed, surrounded by hillsides and cliffs composed of layer upon layer of volcanic basalt, with flat mesas or mountain slopes above. Accumulating their knowledge over centuries, the Paiutes learned to live with the resources of this land, where the desert is often only a few feet from a lake or marsh. The Indians moved with the ripening of the wild plants and the seasonal habits of the animals with whom they shared the land. Their harvesting season began each spring when they moved up into the hills to visit well-known root camps. Some of the Paiute women still return.
We all getting up there together to have a lot of fun. And the women folks are digging these roots and they get them up for their food for winter. And the men go out in the thicket in the summertime, kill a deer and dry them to put away for the winter to live on. That's how we live. I was such age of her, maybe a little older, so I remember. I learned from my grandfolks, grandmas. And I used to have my own digger out of a little iron things like that. And I learned whenever they do, I watch them.
When I was a little girl, I used to come with my folks over here ever since I can remember when I was little. And what I know, just what I hear about, is that they said that the different Indians come over here and they gather here, trade, and they have games and they have races right over the hill, over on the other side. In through there is where they do all their racing, horses and all that kind. And over here on this side, they do all their digging. The women's dig the roots, and then they have their own kind of games going too. They have a little stick game and other kind of games that they did years ago. This is bitter roots. We Indians call it kangich, and this is the time that it's ready when there's little buds on it. And when we dig it up like this, we peel the skin and we break the top off, and then we wash them, and then we lay them out in the sun to dry.
On the hillsides, the Indians found a good variety of plants with edible roots and greens. There was yucca, also known as the wild carrot, and suga, which they ground into flour. Nagutava is the tasty wild onion, and many others. Some of these roots were eaten fresh. Others were carefully dried and stored for winter cooking.
This is camas. Us Paiutes, we call it Basin. And these, they grow mostly down in the meadowlands now, privately owned lands, in which the Indians don't dig down there. They don't dig them anymore like they, many years ago, the older Indians used to dig them.
The camas roots were cooked in an earth oven, a pit lined with hot rocks and filled with alternating layers of camas roots and grass. All this was covered with soil, over which a fire was kept burning for several days until the roots were ready for eating. After the sociability of the spring root gathering, families traveled alone throughout the summer. They moved from one campsite to another, hunting, fishing, and gathering plant foods wherever they traveled. As the summer turned into fall, the women began looking for the bright red chokecherries on the bushes along the riverbanks. They had discovered that the stems could be brewed to make a tasty drink, but the bushes were most highly prized for their crop of berries.
Well, this is the way they do it in the olden days, They have to crush all these berries like that and keep working at it, and I guess till you get enough to make your round patties, And when they get enough of that, why they dry it in the sun. Then when one side dries, then they turn it over and keep checking it that way.
Small insects, ants, larvae, grasshoppers also provided food products in some valleys. In years of drought, nothing was small enough to be overlooked. The Indians were also aware of the aphids swarming among the cane plants in the summer. They discovered that when the insects punctured the underside of the cane leaves, they deposited a drop of sweet liquid, which provided practically the only sweet the Paiutes had. When the liquid dried, it was beaten loose and collected, then tossed in a winnowing tray to get rid of the unwanted cane fragments, leaving only the sweet, sticky particles. Before the settlers and ranchers came, large numbers of Paiutes gathered around Malheur Lake for the tedious job of collecting the minute black wada seeds. They roasted, winnowed, and ground them into meal.
That's what all these, my people, old people, their name is Wadatka. I consider it grows around in Malheur Lake. That's why they get the seed in fall time. Around September, it's ready, a little tiny seed, black seed.
Harney Valley Paiutes thus came to be known as the Wada Eaters, the Wadatika, following the custom of identifying bands of Paiutes according to a major food they eat. The Kuyui Eaters were the Indians who lived around Pyramid Lake in Nevada. They were the ones who harvested the Kuyui suckers as they migrated out of the lake into the Truckee River to spawn. Other groups were the Trout Eaters in the Walker River country, the Cattail Eaters, Ground Squirrel Eaters, also in Nevada. These weren't tribal names because the Paiutes didn't have formal tribal organizations. They lived in small family bands. The number in each group was determined by the food resources in the valley where they lived. When a group grew too large for the food supply, some of the people moved away to join another group or begin a new one. Thus, family ties took the place of tribal associations. Fall was the time when the women gathered and prepared the natural fibers, which, during the winter, they made into an ingenious variety of things. Important to their seasonal travels were the conical-shaped baskets they twined for gathering food and carrying burdens.
I'll tell you about this basket here, what my mother used to make. She used to make a lot of baskets, and I used to watch her how she make it. And I know she make this kind to go out and to use them to pick berries. And she carried on her back like this.
In addition to their gathering baskets, there were two other primary harvesting tools the Paiute women twined: the ladle-shaped beaters, used to loosen seeds from plants and bushes, and trays for winnowing and roasting. First, the seeds and nuts were carefully roasted in a tray of hot coals. The trick was to keep the contents moving to protect the burnable fiber tray. Next, they were tossed in the trays, allowing the wind to blow away the husks and shells. Baskets were also used for cooking. They were tightly coiled or twined and smeared with resin. Unable to put a fiber basket over an open fire, the Paiutes devised an alternative method. They heated rocks in the fire and dropped them into a cooking basket full of water, exchanging hot rocks for cooled ones until the food was cooked. The red-stemmed willows gathered from September through February were the strongest and were preferred by the women for their baskets. In Great Basin caves, archaeologists have found remnants of prehistoric twined and coiled basketry. Some of the fragments have been scientifically tested and dated as being over 9,000 years old. These basket-making techniques have been passed down from mother to daughter ever since those distant times. Twining is the easier and quicker method of basket making and was used most frequently by the Paiute women. Since they were the burden bearers for their families, the women usually disposed of the quickly made baskets rather than carry them on to the next campsite. Coiled baskets, however, were more difficult and time-consuming to make, so they weren't discarded as casually. When coiling was done, it was usually for food bowls and cooking containers made for daily use. Long ago, women learned that for the art of basket making, they needed no complicated tools. They needed only their fingers with the help from a scraping edge and a bit of bone or a small stick. In fact, because of that, basketry may be the oldest of the human arts. Water jugs were a necessity in the desert, and they too were made of natural fibers, tightly woven, heavily resined with hot pitch and red clay. The large jugs were filled when the entire family or band traveled to a new campsite. But a small jug of water was enough for a hunter on a one-day trip after game, and in their constant search for food, the Paiute men were always hunting and fishing wherever the families traveled. For the Paiute men of Harney Valley, fishing began in the spring when migrating salmon came up the Columbia and into the Malheur River. They fished with spears, hooks, nets, and traps.
There used to be salmon along the Drosy River. We used to go there, whole bunch of these man folks, and catch a salmon. They make a long stick and some kind of point of the stick, and just to go around and they catch a salmon. And the women cut them up and dry them, and they just put it over the horse and lead the horse home. That's the way we used to do a long time ago.
Snowmelt from the mountains and upland ridges drains into the valleys and collects in the lowland marshes of the Great Basin. In very early times, waterfowl began coming here on their migratory flights north and south along the Pacific Flyway. At times in the spring and fall, they came in such large numbers that they literally darkened the sky. Here in the marshes was a rich food supply for the Indians, and out of the plant resources, they fashioned their bird hunting devices. Tule rafts to help them collect eggs, nets to snare coots, and duck decoys. Cleverly manipulating tules and tying them with cattail strips, the Indians produced the likeness of a canvasback. The craft of making these decoys appears to be an ancient one. A cache of them was excavated from Lovelock Cave in north-central Nevada, suggesting that they appeared in the Basin culture at least 4,000 years ago. For a final realistic touch, a duck skin would be stretched over the tule form and pinned in place with greasewood twigs. Wherever the bands traveled, the men were busy trapping small animals. But the large, swift animals of the basin, the antelope, deer, and mountain sheep, provided an enormous challenge to the hunters before they acquired horses. So, periodically, bands from neighboring valleys came together to pool their efforts for communal animal drives. Every successful hunt was an occasion for rejoicing. After the meat was cared for, every other part of the animal was put to good use. The men made tools from antlers and bone. A bone needle could help a woman with her weaving. Decorative pieces might be fashioned from bone or from the horn of a mountain sheep. Rattles for dancing and shaman magic were made from the dew claws on the feet of a deer or from the tough internal membranes of the animal. Even the brain was carefully saved to make a solution used in dressing out the hide.
I stretch this hide and then make a lot out of it. Then I make a cradle board, and I make gloves out of it, and moccasins. I most use for cradle board to cover. And when I tend and smoke it for everything I use. It's hard work when you first to start it. Scrape the hides and soaked in the brain for overnight. Then you wash it and stretch it. When we learned from our mother, our grandmother, to teach us how to tend the hides, and I never forget. I just, doing it.
People of the Great Basin became highly skilled at making cordage, which they used to make nets for rabbit drives and for dozens of other uses. They could make lightweight cordage from cattail leaves whenever they wanted to set a trap or fasten items together. But the finest display of their skill was seen in the nets the hunters made from native hemp and milkweed fibers. The netting was so uniform that it's difficult to believe it was actually handmade. Some of the nets for their rabbit drives were hundreds of feet long, and strung out across the desert, they assured the people food for many meals and rabbit fur blankets for the entire family. The rabbit hides were cut into strips and twisted into a furry rope with no skin showing. These strips were strung on a loom and twined together with fiber cordage or bark. Without this warmth, it would have been difficult or impossible for the Paiutes to survive through the cold winter months. By late October, the Indians thought often of the need for warmth as they began to note the signs of approaching winter. At last, when the migratory birds began leaving the marshes, the people knew it was time to move into the sheltered valleys to make their cattail and willow houses for the winter. To build the house, a circle of long, strong willows was secured in the ground for the framework. Traditionally, long ropes of sagebrush bark were used to tie the frame together. As cloth became available, strips of old clothing were also used as ties. Mats to cover the structure were made of cattail leaves tied to willow strips. Cattails were preferred because their flat, moisture-resistant surfaces shed rain and snow like shingles. The only openings were a small smoke hole in the top and a doorway facing toward the rising sun and away from the prevailing basin winds. With the coming of winter, travel was over for the Paiute families. Gathered around a small fire in their houses, wrapped in their rabbit fur blankets, they were thankful for the food gathered and stored throughout the growing seasons. Winter leisure provided time for basket making, carving new tools, listening to the storytellers and the wisdom of the elders. For thousands of years, Native Americans in the Great Basin followed this seasonal cycle of life. Then in the 1800s, the expanding American frontier nearly erased the old way of life. An ancient culture developed by people who recognized the earth as their home and the source of their survival.